Kelpieone here on Stainedglasscuts. In this video, I'll share how to make a mobile I call the twist. I'm calling it that because of the amount of twisting that goes into the brass rods. At the heart of this design are 6 pieces of rod bent into this shape. If you try to make this design, and I hope you do, practice your rod bending first with used coat hangers. I built the prototype for this design over a year ago and made limited notes of what I did. Ooh, bad Kelpieone. So for this video, I had to rediscover and document what I needed to do. A lot of coat hangers. So let's begin. Here are the bending steps I'm going to take you through. First, we'll cut an 18-inch, 3/32 diameter solid brass rod. We'll mark the bending spots on the rod with a Sharpie. Then we'll create a 9mm loop, add a 7mm loop to create a double loop, create a partial 7mm loop, and then a second partial 7mm loop, and finally we'll create a partial 9mm loop, and that will create our piece. Okay, let's do this. Step 1. I'm going to mark 18 inches on my solid brass rod, cut the piece, and file the end smooth. Step 2. Starting at the end of the rod, I'm going to be marking 4 1/8 inch, 8 1/8 inch, and 16 1/2 inches. These will be the bending points when we make our various loops. Step 3. At the 4 1/8 inch mark, I'm creating the 9mm loop portion of the double loop. Gripping the rod with my bail making pliers at the mark, with the 9mm side of the pliers facing away from me and only applying pressure to the short arm, I'll bend the short arm in a clockwise direction, crossing over the top of the 9mm loop. I'll bend the loop just slightly beyond 360 degrees. And then I'll check to be sure that my mark is centered in the bottom of the loop. Step 4. I'll now continue making the 7mm loop of the double loop. With the 9mm side of the pliers facing away from me, short arm to the left, and the pliers gripping the mark, and again, only applying pressure to the short arm, I'll bend the arm in a counterclockwise direction, crossing over the top of the 7mm loop. The goal is to have the mark end up exactly in the middle between the 2 loops. Once I'm happy with that, I'll then push down on both arms, bending them down to roughly a 105-degree angle, keeping the 9mm loop on the top. There's roughly 1.5 inches of rod left from the center of the loops to the end of the short rod. Step 5. At the 8 1/8 inch mark, I'll now create a 7 millimeter partial loop. With the double loop to my left and the 9 millimeter loop on top, I'm placing the 7 millimeter side of my pliers on the outside of the rod, away from what will be the center of the hanger. Gripping the rod very firmly at the mark, I'll roll the pliers towards the double loop. I'm not applying any pressure to the long arm of the rod. And I will roll this around until I've achieved roughly a 75-degree angle. There should be roughly 2 3/4 inches between the crossover point here and the crossover points of the double loop. Step 6. At the 16.5 inch mark, I'll create another 7 millimeter partial loop. I'll begin by grabbing the rod with my pliers with the 7 millimeter loop on the outside, away from what will become the inside. I'll grab the rod and roll it towards the other 7 millimeter loop. No pressure on the short arm. The short arm crosses over the top of the long arm. And again, I'll roll the pliers. They're roughly parallel, and I've got approximately a 75-degree angle. Again, the mark will not be centered in the loop. In this final bending step, I'm making the 9 millimeter bottom loop. First, I'll take my ruler and mark the middle between the crossing points of the two 7 millimeter partial loops. It should be roughly 3.5 inches from each end. Then, placing the 9 millimeter side of my pliers on the outside, inside, outside, I'll bend both arms towards me to create the 9 millimeter loop. The double loop arm, the non-double loop arm should pass under the double loop arm. And we'll keep going until we've got roughly a 105-degree angle. Okay, as you can see, we've got some adjusting to do here. And there you have it. I'll do some final adjusting when we connect these two arms later. Here's how I connect the rod ends. I started by cutting off a 1.5 inch piece of brass tube that has an internal diameter of 3/32 of an inch. I filed the ends smooth. I'll slide the tube over one of the rods, pushing it all the way down as far as it will go, and then I'll insert the other rod end and slide the tube down so it's centered in the middle of the piece of hardware. Later, when doing assembly, the tube will be crimped into place. Here is how each piece of glass will go onto the hardware. You don't need to use 6 pieces of hardware. Any number will do. I'm going to show you how even a single piece of hardware can make a beautiful little mobile. First, I'll put on the chain I made. I've got 5 pieces of double-layered fused glass rondelles, each 2 inches in diameter, into which I've installed brass hangers. I'll feed them onto the hardware. For the outside hanging pieces, I'll start on the inside of the hardware with the rondelle facing up. Make sure I get the right one. And then for the inside blue one, I'll start with it flipped over. The result being that we get them all faced in the correct direction. Just a reminder here, any mobile I show you how to make on my channel has an associated playlist with individual videos and all the skills I use to make it, including those not detailed in this video. For example, not covered in this video are these skills: cutting a straight line, cutting a glass circle, fusing a glass circle, making a chain, drilling a hole in glass, installing a hanger in glass, bending metal rods into loops, and making a glass donut. Okay, let's install the tube and crimp it into place. At this point, I can adjust the sides, the length of the rod with the tube on it, to match the length of the rod on the other side. In this case, I'm going to pull it out just a little bit. And then taking my bail making pliers, I'm going to crimp one side, do a rotation, and crimp the other side. And then this side, I've got roughly 2 3/4 of an inch. And on this side, I've got just about the same, just a little slightly less. So I'm going to just pull the bottom tube, the bottom rod out of the tube just slightly, and then I will crimp it in place. Again, 2 crimps with firm pressure are more than enough to hold the rod in place. And then I'll add the final rondelle on the bottom. And there you have it. A cute little mobile using only one piece of hardware. Now for how I put multiple pieces of hardware together. One change I made from my prototype was to eliminate the swivels, as I see them as a potential failure point. First, I'm going to add a chain to the top of one of our pieces of hardware. And then I'm going to take the next piece of hardware and sliding the 9mm loop onto the rod, I'm going to work this on around until we get it onto the bottom 9mm loop. So as you can see, I have these two connected by their 9mm loops without a swivel. Now for putting it all together, I'll use the same method I demonstrated earlier, but with one major difference. For all but the last piece of hardware, I'll be using the bottom 9mm loop to attach the next piece of hardware. Thus, for the outside loops, the order will be glass, hardware, glass. Because double layer rondelles would make the mobile too heavy, I'm using 2-inch diameter fused rings of glass that I made from donuts. Donuts like these. I showed you how to make the donuts in my last video. Here's a before and after of the firing that turned the donuts to rings in my new Gen Ken fiber kiln. I'll finish up putting all these together and join you outside shortly. And here we are. Hope you found this video interesting. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. Cheers.